Tonight, we journey back to the final days of ancient Egypt, to a time when kingdoms trembled at the mention of Rome, when the Mediterranean world balanced on the edge of transformation. We explore the life of a woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded armies, seduced emperors, and ruled the wealthiest kingdom of her age. This is the story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Before we descend into the marble halls of Alexandria, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. If you enjoy stories that blend history with mystery, power with passion, let us know in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you right now. Some nights, these stories help you drift into sleep. Other nights, they keep you awake, pondering the shadows of the past. So, dim your lights, settle into comfort, and let's begin. The world before Cleopatra. The year was 1609 before the Common Era. In the sprawling city of Alexandria, on the northern coast of Egypt, a child entered the world during a blood-red eclipse. The midwives whispered among themselves, reading omens in the sky, wondering what fate awaited this infant princess. They could not have known that this girl would become the most famous woman of the ancient world, that her name would echo through millennia, that poets and playwrights would immortalize her story long after her kingdom turned to dust. The moment of her birth was recorded in the palace archives, though those records have long since turned to dust. The exact day remains uncertain to modern historians, though they agree on the year. Some sources suggest she was born in the winter months, others in early spring. What we know with certainty is that when Cleopatra drew her first breath, Egypt stood at a crossroads, balanced between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The palace where she was born was itself a marvel, sprawling across perhaps a third of Alexandria's eastern harbor district. Its walls were faced with marble brought from quarries across the Mediterranean. Its floors displayed mosaics depicting scenes from Greek mythology alongside Egyptian hieroglyphs. Gardens filled with exotic plants from Africa and Asia stretched between the buildings. Fountains sprayed water day and night, a display of wealth in a land where water meant life itself. But to understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the Egypt into which she was born. This was not the Egypt of the great pyramid builders. It's not the realm of Tutankhamun or Ramesses the Great. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt had already witnessed more than 3,000 years of civilization. The towering monuments that lined the Nile, the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, the Sphinx that gazed eternally across the desert sands, all these belonged to a distant past, as ancient to Cleopatra as she is to us. The Egypt of Cleopatra's birth was a Hellenistic kingdom, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture that had emerged from the fragmenting empire of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, his vast conquests, stretching from Greece to India, were divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, a Macedonian Greek who would establish a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The transition from Alexander's rule to that of the Ptolemies was not immediate. In the chaos following Alexander's death, his empire fragmented rapidly. The Diadochi, Alexander's generals, fought among themselves for control of different territories. Ptolemy moved quickly to secure Egypt, understanding its strategic and economic value. He seized Alexander's body as it was being transported back to Macedonia, bringing it first to Memphis and later to Alexandria, where it became a symbol of legitimacy, connecting Ptolemy's rule to Alexander's legendary conquest. Ptolemy declared himself satrap of Egypt in 323 before the Common Era, but he did not proclaim himself king until 305 before the Common Era. When it became clear that Alexander's empire would never be reunited, he took the title Ptolemy the First Soter, meaning savior, and established practices that would characterize the dynasty for centuries to come. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as pharaohs, adopting Egyptian titles and iconography while maintaining their Greek culture and language. This dual identity was central to their strategy. To the Greek population of Alexandria and the other Greek cities in Egypt, they were Hellenic monarchs, patrons of Greek culture and philosophy. To the native Egyptian population, they were pharaohs in the ancient tradition, making offerings to Egyptian gods and supporting Egyptian temples. This cultural balancing act required careful management. The Ptolemies invested enormous resources in Egyptian religion, building and restoring temples throughout the Nile Valley. The great temple at Edfu, dedicated to the god Horus, was begun under Ptolemy III and completed over 2 centuries of construction. The temple at Dendora, sacred to the goddess Hathor, where Cleopatra herself would later be depicted, received continuous Ptolemaic patronage. Alexandria itself was Alexander's creation, founded in 331 before the Common Era on the Mediterranean coast. The city was designed to be a bridge between the Greek world and ancient Egypt, a cosmopolitan metropolis where cultures could mingle and trade could flourish. By Cleopatra's time, Alexandria had grown into one of the greatest cities in the world, rivaling even Rome in splendor and sophistication. The city's plan was remarkable for its time. Unlike the organic, chaotic growth of most ancient cities, Alexandria was laid out in a careful grid pattern, with broad streets intersecting at right angles. The main avenue, the Canopic Way, stretched for more than 3 miles from the eastern to the western gates, wide enough for 8 chariots to ride abreast. Marble colonnades lined the major streets, providing shelter from sun and rain. Underground sewers handled waste, a sophisticated system that would not be matched in European cities until the modern era. The city's harbor could hold more than 1,000 ships. Its streets were laid out in a perfect grid, wide and clean, lined with marble colonnades. At the entrance to the harbor stood the Pharos, the great lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rising more than 300 feet into the air. Its beacon fire could be seen from 30 miles out to sea, guiding merchants and travelers to Egypt's shore. The Pharos was an engineering marvel, constructed of white limestone blocks fitted together with molten lead. It rose in 3 tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top. At the summit burned a fire, tended day and night, its light reflected and magnified by bronze mirrors. Some accounts claim that these mirrors were so sophisticated they could focus sunlight to set enemy ships on fire at a distance. Though this may be exaggeration, what is certain is that the lighthouse guided shipping for more than 1,000 years, until earthquakes finally toppled it in the 14th century of the Common Era. The city was divided into distinct districts. The royal quarter, where the palace complex stood, occupied the eastern harbor. The Greek quarter housed the citizens who formed Alexandria's elite class. The Egyptian quarter was home to native Egyptians who worked as laborers, artisans, and servants. The Jewish quarter housed one of the largest Jewish communities outside Judea, and it was here that the Torah was translated from Hebrew into Greek, creating the Septuagint that would become the standard text for early Christianity. Alexandria's population during Cleopatra's time is estimated at between 300,000 and 500,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Its population was remarkably diverse. Greeks from every city-state, Macedonians who had come with Alexander or his successors, native Egyptians from up and down the Nile, Jews from Judea and the diaspora, traders from Carthage and Phoenicia, scholars from Athens and Rhodes, merchants from as far away as India, all mixed in Alexandria's streets and marketplaces. But Alexandria's true glory lay not in its physical structures, but in its intellectual life. The city housed the great library, the most comprehensive collection of knowledge in the ancient world. Scholars estimated that the library contained between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, encompassing the wisdom of Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond. Adjacent to the library stood the museum, not a museum in our modern sense, but a temple dedicated to the Muses, where scholars lived and worked, supported by royal patronage. The Library of Alexandria was more than just a collection of texts. It was an active research institution, the first of its kind in human history. The Ptolemies, beginning with Ptolemy I and II, made it their policy to acquire every book that existed. The ships entering Alexandria's harbor were searched for books. Any texts found were confiscated, copied by scribes employed by the library, and the copies returned to the owners, while the originals were added to the collection. Agents of the library traveled throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, purchasing manuscripts from private collections, making copies of texts in temple libraries and archives. The library acquired the official state archives of Athens. It obtained scientific and medical texts from Mesopotamia and Persia. It collected Hindu philosophical works from India and accounts of distant lands from traveling merchants. Within the museum, the greatest minds of the Hellenistic age worked and taught. Euclid systematized geometry, his Elements becoming the foundational text for mathematics that would remain in use for over 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, coming within 50 miles of the actual measurement. He did this by comparing the angle of the sun at noon in Alexandria with the angle in Syene, far to the south, and applying geometric principles to deduce the Earth's size. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the museum's medical school, conducted systematic dissection of human cadavers, a practice forbidden in most of the ancient world. They mapped the nervous system, distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, understood the function of the brain as the center of intelligence rather than the heart, as had been previously believed. Their anatomical discoveries would not be matched until the Renaissance. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun at the center and having the Earth revolve around it. This correct understanding would be forgotten and only rediscovered 1700 years later by Copernicus. Hipparchus created star catalogues, mapped the heavens, and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. Clifficus composed poetry and compiled a massive catalogue of the library's holdings, running to 120 volumes. Here, mathematicians calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Astronomers mapped the stars and understood that the Earth revolved around the sun, a truth that would be forgotten and rediscovered more than 1,000 years later. Physicians dissected human bodies to understand anatomy, physicians who would not be surpassed in their knowledge until the Renaissance. Poets composed verses that would influence literature for centuries. This was the Alexandria of learning, of culture, of cosmopolitan sophistication. The economic foundations of Alexandria's splendor rested on Egypt's agricultural wealth. The Nile's annual flood deposited nutrient-rich silt across the valley, making Egyptian soil among the most fertile in the world. Egypt fed not only itself but much of the Mediterranean, exporting vast quantities of grain. The Ptolemies controlled this agricultural bounty through a sophisticated bureaucratic system, taxing farmers, regulating prices, and managing storage and distribution. Beyond grain, Egypt produced papyrus, the ancient world's writing material. Manufactured from reeds that grew along the Nile, Egyptian papyrus was exported throughout the Mediterranean. Alexandria also became a center for luxury goods, a trading hub where products from Africa, Asia, and Europe were exchanged. Spices from India, silk from China, ivory from Africa, all passed through Alexandria's markets. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization, the Ptolemaic dynasty was crumbling from within. The practice of sibling marriage, adopted from Egyptian pharaonic tradition, had become standard among the Ptolemies. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, in an attempt to keep power within the family and maintain the purity of the bloodline. But this inbreeding had consequences, both genetic and political. The royal family became a nest of vipers, siblings plotting against siblings, parents against children, in an endless struggle for supremacy. The history of the Ptolemaic dynasty was soaked in blood. Ptolemy IV Philopator murdered his uncle to secure his throne. Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, also known as Physcon, or Potbelly, killed his nephew and Corula, then married his nephew's widow, who was also his own sister. When she later rebelled against him, he had their son murdered and sent her his body parts as a birthday gift. These were not isolated incidents but patterns that repeated across generations. The murders, poisonings, and civil wars that characterized Ptolemaic succession struggles had multiple causes. The custom of co-rule meant that siblings often had equal claims to power, leading to conflict. The presence of multiple queens and concubines produced numerous potential heirs, each with their own supporters among the nobility and bureaucracy. The enormous wealth of Egypt made control of the throne worth any crime. At the time of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, the dynasty's weakness was apparent to everyone. Rome, growing stronger with each passing year, openly discussed annexing Egypt. Roman senators proposed making Egypt a province, arguing that the Ptolemies were too corrupt and incompetent to govern such a wealthy kingdom. Only by paying enormous bribes to powerful Romans could Ptolemy XII maintain his throne. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, known as Alyattes, which meant flute player, was a weak and unpopular ruler. He had come to power through intrigue and maintained his throne through the support of Rome, paying enormous bribes to Roman politicians to secure their backing. His reign was marked by instability, rebellion, and exile. At one point, he was driven from Egypt entirely and had to purchase Roman military intervention to regain his throne. His nickname, Alyattes, came from his love of playing the flute at banquets. the behavior that many Alexandrians considered undignified for a king. Ancient sources describe him as more interested in music and wine than in governance. He debased Egypt's currency to pay his debts to Rome, causing inflation and economic hardship. He raised taxes repeatedly, making himself hated by rich and poor alike. In 58 before the Common Era, the Alexandrians had enough. They rose in revolt, driving Ptolemy XII from his palace. He fled to Rome, bringing enormous quantities of gold to bribe senators and secure Roman support for his restoration. While he was gone, his daughter Bernice IV, Cleopatra's older sister, seized the throne. Bernice ruled for 3 years. She married twice during this period. The first husband mysteriously dying shortly after the wedding, likely poisoned when he proved unsatisfactory. Ancient sources describe him as utterly worthless, which apparently made Bernice decide she was better off without him. Her second husband, Archelaus, was a Greek prince who ruled alongside her until Ptolemy XII returned with Roman legions. In 55 before the Common Era, the Roman general Gabinius invaded Egypt with Ptolemy XII at the head of his army. The fighting was brief. Bernice's forces were defeated, and she was captured. Ptolemy XII, showing the ruthlessness that ran in the Ptolemaic bloodline, had his own daughter executed for her presumption in taking his throne. Cleopatra, then about 14 years old, witnessed this brutal lesson in the consequences of losing power struggles. The identity of Cleopatra's mother remains uncertain, lost to the gaps in historical records. She may have been Cleopatra V, Ptolemy's wife, or she may have been a concubine. This uncertainty matters because it leaves open questions about Cleopatra's ancestry, her possible Egyptian heritage mixing with Macedonian Greek blood. What we know for certain is that Cleopatra was the third daughter of Ptolemy XII, born into a world of palace intrigue where survival required intelligence, cunning, and ruthlessness. Cleopatra's brothers and sisters included Bernice IV, executed for rebellion, Cleopatra VI, who disappears from historical records and may have died young, Arsinoe IV, who would later side with Ptolemy XIII against Cleopatra in the Alexandrian War. Ptolemy XIII, 10 years younger than Cleopatra, and Ptolemy XIV, 12 years younger. Of these 6 siblings, only Cleopatra would die of natural causes, or at least by her own choice. The others were murdered, died in battle, or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. From her earliest years, Cleopatra received an education befitting a princess who might one day rule. Unlike most of her Ptolemaic ancestors, who never bothered to learn the Egyptian language, speaking only Greek at court, Cleopatra studied Egyptian along with Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, and several other languages. Ancient sources tell us she was fluent in as many as 9 languages, an extraordinary accomplishment that would serve her well in diplomatic negotiations. The education of a Ptolemaic princess began young, typically around age 5 or 6. Cleopatra would have learned to read and write in Greek, studying the classics of Greek literature, Homer's epics of the Trojan War, the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes. She would have memorized passages from these works, the mark of an educated person in the Hellenistic world. Mathematics was considered essential knowledge for rulers who would need to manage Egypt's complex economy. Cleopatra studied geometry, following the principles laid down by Euclid. She learned arithmetic and accounting, understanding taxation systems and currency exchange rates. She studied astronomy, learning to calculate the movements of celestial bodies, knowledge that was useful both for navigation and for managing the agricultural calendar that depended on the Nile's flood. Philosophy was central to Greek education. Cleopatra would have studied the major schools of Greek philosophy, the idealism of Plato, the systematic thinking of Aristotle, the Stoic emphasis on virtue and the Epicurean pursuit of pleasure, understood as the absence of pain. These weren't merely academic exercises but practical training in how to think clearly, argue persuasively, and make difficult decisions. She studied rhetoric and philosophy under the tutelage of scholars at the museum. She learned mathematics and astronomy, medicine and music. The young princess absorbed the accumulated knowledge of centuries, preparing herself not just to rule, but to engage with the intellectual currents of her age. Plutarch, the Greek historian who wrote about her decades after her death, noted that it was not just her beauty that made her compelling, but her conversation, her quick wit, her ability to charm anyone she spoke with. Music and the arts were also part of her education. The Ptolemies prided themselves on being patrons of culture, and royal children were expected to appreciate and sometimes perform music. Cleopatra learned to play various instruments, possibly including the lyre or the aulos, a double reed instrument. She studied dance, poetry, and dramatic performance. But what truly set Cleopatra apart from her ancestors was her study of Egyptian language and culture. For nearly 3 centuries, Ptolemaic rulers had governed Egypt without bothering to learn the language of their subjects. They spoke Greek at court, issued orders in Greek, and relied on interpreters to communicate with native Egyptians. Cleopatra broke this pattern deliberately. She studied Egyptian hieroglyphs, the formal script used in temple inscriptions. She learned Demotic, the everyday script used for business and personal correspondence. She studied the Egyptian language itself, with its complex verb forms and rich vocabulary. This was not merely linguistic study, but cultural immersion. By learning Egyptian, Cleopatra could read religious texts, understand temple rituals, and communicate directly with Egyptian priests and officials. This decision had profound political implications. By learning Egyptian, Cleopatra positioned herself as a true pharaoh, not merely a Greek queen ruling over Egypt, but an Egyptian ruler in the ancient tradition. She could visit temples and speak with priests without interpreters. She could read prophecies and religious texts herself. She understood the hopes and fears of her Egyptian subjects in ways her ancestors never had. But alongside her formal education, Cleopatra learned harder lessons in the royal court. She watched as her older sister, Bernice IV, seized power when their father was driven into exile. She witnessed the brutal return of Ptolemy XII, who had his own daughter Bernice executed for her betrayal. She observed the endless maneuvering, the shifting alliances, the sudden reversals of fortune that characterized Ptolemaic politics. These lessons in power and survival would prove invaluable. The young Cleopatra would have been present at court ceremonies, watching her father receive ambassadors, issue decrees, settle disputes. She would have observed how power actually worked, how decisions were made, how alliances were formed and broken. She would have seen her father's weakness, his dependence on Rome, his willingness to humiliate himself and bankrupt Egypt to maintain his throne. These observations taught her what kind of ruler she did not want to be. She also learned from her father's strengths, few as they were. Ptolemy XII understood, at least, that Rome was the power that mattered, that Egypt's independence depended on maintaining good relations with whoever controlled Rome. He cultivated Julius Caesar, Pompey, and other influential Romans. Understanding that Egyptian gold could buy Roman protection, Cleopatra would later apply this lesson with far greater skill and sophistication. The palace itself was a school of politics. Cleopatra would have observed the eunuchs who served as advisors and administrators, the Greek officials who managed the bureaucracy, the Egyptian priests who maintained the temples and the old religion, the merchants and bankers who controlled trade and finance. She learned to read people, to understand their motivations, to recognize who had real power versus who merely appeared powerful. As Cleopatra grew from child to young woman, the wider world beyond Egypt's borders was convulsing with change. Rome, once merely one power among many in the Mediterranean, had become the dominant force, conquering territory after territory, absorbing kingdom after kingdom into its expanding empire. The Roman Republic, governed by a senate of aristocrats, was itself fracturing, torn apart by civil wars between rival generals who commanded legions loyal to them personally rather than to the state. Egypt, wealthy beyond measure from the fertile Nile Valley's agricultural bounty, had become a prize that powerful Romans coveted. Some openly advocated for annexation, arguing that Egypt should become a Roman province. Others saw Egypt as a source of loans and bribes, a kingdom that could be manipulated and exploited while maintaining the fiction of independence. Ptolemy XII understood this precarious position. He spent lavishly to cultivate Roman allies, including Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, hoping that their protection would preserve his throne. In 51 before the Common Era, when Cleopatra was 18 years old, her father died. His will named her and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, then only 10 years old, as co-rulers of Egypt. Following Ptolemaic tradition, they were married to each other, though this was purely a political arrangement. The real power initially rested with Cleopatra, the older and more capable of the two siblings. The Egypt that Cleopatra inherited was facing serious challenges. The kingdom's finances had been devastated by years of her father's bribes to Roman politicians. The treasury was depleted, Taxes had been raised repeatedly, creating resentment among farmers and merchants. The Nile flood, which was supposed to be regular and predictable, had been unreliable in recent years, leading to poor harvests and food shortages. Beyond these immediate problems, Egypt faced an existential threat from Rome's relentless expansion. In the century before Cleopatra's birth, Rome had conquered Greece, Macedonia, Syria, and much of Asia Minor. It controlled the entire northern coast of the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece. It had made client kingdoms of most of the remaining independent states. Egypt was wealthy and strategically located, controlling the grain supply that fed Rome itself. How long could it remain independent? Cleopatra's first acts as queen showed her political intelligence. She reduced certain taxes to win popular support. She made offerings at Egyptian temples, presenting herself as a traditional pharaoh devoted to the gods. She appeared at public ceremonies, making herself visible to her subjects in ways her father had often failed to do. Coins minted in the early years of her reign show only Cleopatra's image, omitting her brother Ptolemy entirely. This was a deliberate statement about who truly held power. Official documents from this period list Cleopatra's name first, another assertion of her primacy. She was not content to be a figurehead while maladvisors ruled in her name. But Cleopatra's position was far from secure. The same court officials who had advised her father, men like the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus, saw the young Ptolemy as more malleable than his sister. They began to marginalize Cleopatra, conducting state business in Ptolemy's name alone, working to push her aside. These men represented powerful interests in Alexandria. Pothinus controlled much of the palace bureaucracy. Achilles commanded the army. Theodotus had influence over education and culture. Together, they formed a faction that believed they could control Egypt through the young, pliable Ptolemy while eliminating his capable, independent-minded sister. The conflict between Cleopatra and these advisors played out over 3 years. She attempted to assert her authority through official decrees, public appearances, and cultivation of her own supporters among the nobility and priesthood. They countered by controlling access to the king, managing state finances, and commanding the loyalty of the army. For the first 3 years of their joint reign, Cleopatra struggled to maintain her authority. She attempted to assert her independence by issuing coins with only her image, omitting her brother entirely. She insisted on being named first in official documents, but the forces arrayed against her were powerful. By 48, before the Common Era, her enemies had gained the upper hand. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, abandoning the palace and retreating into the eastern territories of Egypt. The immediate cause of her expulsion is not entirely clear in the historical sources. Some suggest that a bad Nile flood and resulting food crisis had created unrest, which her enemies blamed on her policies. Others suggest that Pothinus and Achilles simply decided the time was right to eliminate her, that Ptolemy XIII was now old enough to rule without seeming like a complete puppet, and that they no longer needed Cleopatra. She did not flee in despair. However, Cleopatra understood that power was never truly lost as long as one had the will to fight for it. She traveled to Syria, where she began recruiting an army. Roman soldiers stationed in the region, Egyptian loyalists who had followed her into exile, mercenaries attracted by the promise of plunder, all were gathered under her banner. By the spring of 48, before the Common Era, Cleopatra had assembled a force sufficient to challenge her brother's control of Egypt. Her army gathered at Pelusium, on Egypt's eastern border, facing her brother's forces across the barren ground. A civil war seemed inevitable. Whether would fight sister for control of the throne, Egyptians would kill Egyptians, and regardless of who won, Egypt would be weakened. This was the situation when news arrived of events occurring far to the north, in Greece, where Rome's civil war was reaching its climax. But before she could march on Alexandria, events in the wider world intervened. Events that would change not only Cleopatra's fate, but the destiny of the entire Mediterranean world. In Greece, 2 Roman armies clashed in one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world. On one side stood Pompey the Great, defending the Senate and the traditional republican order. On the other stood Julius Caesar, the brilliant general who had conquered Gaul and now sought supreme power in Rome. The Roman Civil War had been building for years. Rome was no longer the small city-state that had defeated Carthage and conquered Greece. It was an empire, stretching from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine River to the Sahara Desert. Managing such vast territories required powerful generals commanding legions loyal to them personally, rather than to the abstract notion of the Roman state. Julius Caesar had spent nearly a decade conquering Gaul, modern France and Belgium, subduing Germanic tribes, even crossing the English Channel to invade Britain. He had won spectacular victories, accumulated enormous wealth, and gained the fanatical loyalty of his legions, who had become rich from the spoils of his campaigns. Pompey the Great, older than Caesar and more established in Roman politics, had conquered the eastern Mediterranean, defeating pirates, subduing Syria, reorganizing Asia Minor. He too commanded loyal legions and had grown immensely wealthy from his campaigns. The Senate, fearing Caesar's popularity and power, allied with Pompey, hoping to use him to check Caesar's ambitions. The crisis came in 49 before the Common Era, when the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar, knowing that his enemies planned to prosecute him once he was without his army's protection, refused. Instead, he marched his legions across the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, declaring his famous words, "The die is cast." Civil war erupted. Caesar moved with characteristic speed, seizing Italy before Pompey could organize resistance. Pompey fled to Greece with the Senate and much of Rome's remaining forces. For more than a year, the two armies maneuvered, fought smaller engagements, and prepared for a decisive battle. At Pharsalus, in central Greece, on the 9th of August, 48, before the Common Era, Caesar's forces achieved a stunning victory. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Caesar's tactical genius and the discipline of his veteran legions overwhelmed Pompey's larger army. Pompey himself fled the battlefield, seeking refuge with whatever allies he could find. Egypt, wealthy and with historical ties to Pompey, seemed like a logical choice. Pompey had been a patron of Ptolemy XII, had helped restore him to his throne. Surely his son would grant him sanctuary. Pompey's ship sailed toward the Egyptian coast, toward Pelusium, where the armies of Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra faced each other in tense standoff. But Ptolemy's advisors saw an opportunity. If they sheltered Pompey, they would make an enemy of Caesar. If they captured Pompey and delivered him to Caesar, they would win the victor's gratitude. The decision was made quickly, brutally. As Pompey's boat approached the shore, Egyptian soldiers rowed out to meet him. They told him that the young king wished to greet him personally, that he should come ashore with only a few companions. Pompey, despite his wife's warnings that this felt like a trap, stepped into the Egyptian boat. As soon as they were out of sight of his ship, the Egyptians attacked. Pompey was stabbed repeatedly, his body left to lie on the beach, his head severed to be presented to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later, pursuing his defeated rival, the Egyptians offered him Pompey's head. Caesar, according to Plutarch, wept at the sight. Pompey had been his rival, yes, but also his son-in-law, married to Caesar's daughter Julia, who had died years before. The manner of Pompey's death, murdered by those he thought would offer him refuge, struck Caesar as dishonorable and cowardly. Caesar took up residence in the royal palace, ostensibly to mediate the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, and to ensure that Egypt's debts to Rome were settled. He brought with him only 4,000 soldiers, a small force by the standards of Roman legions, but sufficient, he thought, to maintain order in a city where he believed himself to be dealing with weak and fractious siblings, fighting over a throne. He had not reckoned on Cleopatra's determination and daring. The carpet and the conquest. Cleopatra understood that her brother's forces controlled Alexandria, that any attempt to enter the city openly would result in her capture or death. But she also understood that if she could reach Caesar personally, if she could speak to him directly, she might convince him to support her claim to the throne. The question was how to get past her brother's guards, how to enter the palace undetected. The solution became legend. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself rolled up inside a carpet. Some versions of the story say it was actually a bedroll or sack used for transporting. Betting, her most trusted servant, a Sicilian named Apollodorus, posed as a merchant delivering goods to the palace. He carried the rolled carpet through the gates, through the corridors, into the very chamber where Caesar was staying. When Apollodorus unrolled the carpet, Cleopatra emerged, at Caesar's feet. The image of the beautiful young queen tumbling out of a carpet, at the feet of the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world, has captivated imaginations for 2,000 years. Artists have painted it, Poets have versed it, filmmakers have dramatized it, but what made this moment significant was not the theatricality of Cleopatra's entrance, clever though it was. What mattered was what happened next. Cleopatra was 21 years old, Caesar was 52. He had spent his life in the brutal world of Roman politics and military campaigns. He had survived civil wars, commanded armies, accumulated enormous wealth and power. He had seen everything, or so he thought. Then this young woman appeared in his chamber, speaking to him in flawless Latin, matching wits with him, making her case with intelligence and charm. Plutarch wrote that it was not Cleopatra's beauty alone that captivated those who met her, but rather her personality, her conversation, her ability to engage anyone on their own terms. She could discuss philosophy with scholars, military strategy with generals, poetry with artists. And with Caesar, she discussed politics and power, the two subjects closest to his heart. Cleopatra made her case simply. She was the rightful ruler of Egypt, deposed by court officials who served their own interests rather than Egypt's. Her brother was a child, manipulated by these same officials. Egypt needed strong leadership, and she could provide it, with Roman support. In exchange, Egypt would remain a loyal ally to Rome, providing grain, gold, and whatever else Caesar required. Caesar, pragmatic and calculating, saw the logic in her argument, but he also saw something else in this remarkable young woman. A partnership began that night, both political and personal. By the time morning came, Caesar had decided to support Cleopatra's claim to the throne. When Ptolemy XIII learned that his sister had gained access to Caesar and won his support, he was enraged. He ripped off his royal diadem and threw it to the ground, declaring that he had been betrayed. The court officials saw their careful plans unraveling. They had thought to control Caesar, to use him to confirm Ptolemy's sole rule and eliminate Cleopatra. Instead, Caesar announced that he would uphold the will of Ptolemy XII, which had named both siblings as but Ptolemy's advisors were not prepared to accept this decision. They began to mobilize the Egyptian army, calling troops to Alexandria. Caesar suddenly found himself besieged in the royal palace, trapped with Cleopatra and his small force of 4,000 legionaries. The Alexandrian War had begun. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were confined to the palace complex, surrounded by hostile forces. Ptolemy's general Achilles commanded an army of 20,000 soldiers, many of them former Roman legionaries who had settled in Egypt after serving under Mark Antony's father years before. These were experienced, disciplined troops, and they outnumbered Caesar's forces 5-1. Caesar, however, was one of the greatest military commanders in history. He fortified the palace, seized key buildings in the harbor district, and sent urgent messages to Roman allies in Asia Minor, calling for reinforcements. In the fighting that followed, part of Alexandria burned, including, according to some accounts, sections of the Great Library, though the full extent of the damage to the library remains debated by historians. During those months of siege, while arrows flew and buildings burned, the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra deepened. They were, in a very real sense, partners in survival. If Caesar fell, Cleopatra would certainly be killed. If Cleopatra were captured, Caesar's position in Egypt would become untenable. They depended on each other absolutely. In January of 47, before the Common Era, Roman reinforcements finally arrived. Mithridates of Pergamum marched into Egypt with 13,000 soldiers, battle-hardened troops loyal to Caesar. Ptolemy XIII split his forces, sending part of his army to stop Mithridates while maintaining the siege of the palace. It was a fatal mistake. Caesar broke out of the palace with his soldiers, linked up with Mithridates' forces, and trapped Ptolemy's divided army. The battle that followed, fought near the Nile Delta, was decisive. Ptolemy's forces were routed. The young king himself fled in a boat that capsized in the river. His body, weighed down by golden armor, sank beneath the muddy waters of the Nile. With Ptolemy dead and his forces scattered, Cleopatra's position was secure. Caesar installed her as Queen of Egypt, though he paired her with her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, then only 12 years old. To maintain the fiction of coral required by Egyptian tradition, everyone understood, however, that Cleopatra was the true power in Egypt. But Caesar and Cleopatra's relationship had become more than political. Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. In the culture of ancient Rome, this was scandalous. Caesar was already married to Calpurnia, a Roman noblewoman. Roman law forbade marriage between Romans and foreigners. Yet Caesar acknowledged the relationship, and when Cleopatra gave birth to his son in late 47, before the Common Era, she named him Ptolemy Caesar. The people of Alexandria called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar remained in Egypt for 2 more months after the war's end, a surprisingly long time given that his civil war with Pompey's remaining supporters was not yet finished. Ancient sources tell us that Caesar and Cleopatra spent these months cruising on the Nile aboard Cleopatra's royal barge, traveling deep into Upper Egypt, almost to the border with Ethiopia. The barge was a floating palace, opulent beyond imagining, and the voyage allowed them to display their alliance to the Egyptian people, while enjoying each other as company away from the intrigues of Alexandria's court. Eventually, duty called Caesar back to Rome. He left behind 3 legions to ensure Cleopatra's security and departed for campaigns in Asia Minor and Africa, where remnants of Pompey's forces still resisted. Cleopatra, now firmly established on Egypt's throne, set about the business of governance. She reduced taxes, restored stability to Egypt's economy, and cultivated the priesthood of Egyptian gods, presenting herself as a traditional pharaoh rather than a foreign Greek ruler. She had herself depicted in Egyptian style on temple walls, wearing the traditional double crown, making offerings to the gods. At the temple of Hathor at Dendra, reliefs still show Cleopatra and Caesarion, depicted as pharaohs, Cleopatra wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In 46, before the Common Era, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She traveled to the imperial capital with Caesarion and an enormous retinue, establishing herself in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber River. Her presence in Rome was controversial. Romans were suspicious of kings and queens, their republic having been founded in opposition to monarchy. The sight of an Egyptian queen, dripping with jewels and oriental splendor, residing in Caesar's villa, aroused resentment. Caesar commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra, depicting her as the goddess Venus, and had it placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestor of Caesar's family. This was extraordinary, an honor never before granted to a living person in a Roman temple. It suggested that Caesar saw Cleopatra as more than a foreign ally, that he envisioned some permanent role for her in his future plans. But Caesar's enemies in the Senate, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, feared that Caesar intended to make himself king, to transform the Roman Republic into a monarchy. They saw Cleopatra's presence as evidence of Caesar's monarchical ambitions. The famous orator Cicero wrote in a letter that he hated the queen, expressing the contempt that many Romans felt toward her. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 before the Common Era, Caesar's enemies struck. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber in the theater of Pompey, the conspirators surrounded him. They stabbed him 23 times, and he fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding to death on the marble floor. News of Caesar's assassination reached Cleopatra in her villa. Her position in Rome, never secure, had suddenly become dangerous. Caesar's death meant the collapse of the political order that had protected her. New civil wars would certainly follow as Caesar's supporters and assassins fought for control of the Republic. Egypt's stability and Cleopatra's own life might be threatened. She departed Rome quickly, returning to Alexandria with Caesar. Shortly after her return, her brother and nominal co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died under mysterious circumstances. Ancient historians believed Cleopatra had him poisoned, eliminating any potential rival to her authority. She elevated Caesarion, now 3 years old, to the position of co-ruler, making him Ptolemy XV. For the next 3 years, Cleopatra focused on consolidating her power in Egypt and watching as Rome tore itself apart in yet another civil war. Caesar's assassins, calling themselves liberators, fled Italy as Caesar's supporters rallied. Mark Antony, Caesar's most capable general and closest ally, seized Caesar's papers and much of his wealth. Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted heir, appeared in Rome, claiming his inheritance. The 2 men, along with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals, formed a second triumvirate, a 3-man dictatorship that divided control of the Roman world among themselves. They proscribed hundreds of their enemies, including Cicero, who was hunted down and killed. In 42 before the Common Era, at Philippi in northern Greece, the triumvirs defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius. The assassins of Caesar were dead, but Rome remained divided between the 3 victors. The empire was partitioned. Octavian took the west, Italy and Gaul. Lepidus, the weakest of the three, received Africa. Mark Antony took the east, including Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and responsibility for the ongoing war against the Parthian Empire. It was in his eastern domains that Antony would encounter Cleopatra, beginning a relationship that would define the rest of both their lives. The meeting at Tarsus, Mark Antony was not Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and disciplined, Antony was impulsive and passionate. Where Caesar was slender and sharp-featured, Antony was broad-shouldered and powerful, a soldier's soldier who fought at the front of his troops. He was renowned for his loyalty to friends, his generosity to supporters, his love of pleasure and spectacle. He was also one of Rome's most capable military commanders, having distinguished himself in campaigns from Gaul to Egypt to Greece. In 41 before the Common Era, as Antony established his authority over Rome's eastern provinces, he needed money. The civil wars had been expensive, legions needed to be paid, and the eastern campaigns against Parthia that he was planning would require enormous resources. Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the region, was an obvious source of funds. Antony had other concerns about Egypt as well. During the recent civil wars, Cleopatra's support had been ambiguous. She had sent some aid to the triumvirs, but had also maintained contact with Brutus and Cassius. Antony wanted to ensure that Egypt would be a reliable ally in the conflicts to come. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, on the southern coast of Asia Minor. Cleopatra understood that this summons was both an opportunity and a test. She had lost Caesar, her great patron and protector. She needed to establish a new relationship with Rome's new masters. Antony controlled the eastern provinces, the regions closest to Egypt. If she could win his support, Egypt's position would be secure. If she alienated him, he had the power to depose her, to install a rival on Egypt's throne. She decided to make an entrance that would be remembered. Rather than traveling by land like a supplicant, she came by sea in her royal barge. Sailing up the Kidnus River to Tarsus, Plutarch's description of her arrival has become one of the most famous passages in ancient literature. The barge, he wrote, had a stern of gold, its purple sails billowing in the wind. Silver oars beat time to the music of flutes, pipes, and lyres. Cleopatra herself reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Her attendants were costumed as Nereids and Graces, sea nymphs attending the goddess. The air was heavy with the scent of incense. As the barge approached Tarsus, crowds lined the riverbanks, following it upstream, until even the marketplace emptied, and Antony found himself sitting alone on his judgment seat, abandoned by his audience. It was political theater of the highest order, a display of wealth and power calculated to impress and seduce. Cleopatra was showing Antony that Egypt was no minor client kingdom, but a great power in its own right. She was no nervous supplicant, but a queen who met him as an equal. Antony invited her to dinner. She suggested he dine with her instead. That first evening, aboard her barge, Cleopatra overwhelmed Antony with opulence. The banquet included dozens of courses, exotic foods prepared by the finest cooks, wine served in golden goblets, and decorations that changed for each course. Plutarch reports that after the meal, Cleopatra gave the golden vessels to Antony's officers as gifts, along with the couches and decorations, and had litters and bearers provided to carry the officers back to their lodgings. The next night, Antony tried to outdo her extravagance, but his banquet, though lavish, seemed plain by comparison. Cleopatra laughed and mocked him gently, charming him with her wit. A famous story from these dinners involves a wager. Cleopatra boasted that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, an enormous sum. Antony, skeptical, accepted the bet. At the next banquet, Cleopatra ordered an ordinary meal, nothing particularly special. Antony began to laugh, thinking he had won. Then Cleopatra called for vinegar. She removed one of her pearl earrings, said to be the largest and most valuable in the world, dropped it into the cup of vinegar, let it dissolve, and drank it. The pearl, worth more than 10 million sesterces, was gone. She reached for her other earring, but Antony stopped her, conceding the wager. These stories, whether entirely factual or embellished over time, capture something essential about how Cleopatra presented herself to Antony. She dazzled him with wealth and spectacle, yes, but more than that. She engaged him with her personality, her humor, her intelligence. Like Caesar before him, Antony found himself captivated not just by a beautiful woman, but by a formidable intellect who could match him in conversation and exceed him in cultural sophistication. Antony returned with Cleopatra to Alexandria that winter, postponing his planned campaigns against the Parthians. In Alexandria, they founded what they called the inimitable livers, a society devoted to luxury and pleasure. They spent their time in banquets and revels, in philosophical discussions and theatrical performances. They hunted and fished together, wandered the streets of Alexandria in disguise, playing pranks on the inhabitants. These months of indulgence in Alexandria have been used by ancient and modern historians alike to paint both Cleopatra and Antony as decadent and self-indulgent rulers more interested in pleasure than duty. But this interpretation may be too simplistic. The inimitable livers was also a religious society dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and theatre, who was associated in Egypt with Osiris. Antony presented himself as the new Dionysus, Cleopatra as the new Isis, linking themselves to divine power in both Greek and Egyptian tradition. Moreover, the months they spent together were not purely devoted to pleasure. They were also building a political alliance. Cleopatra needed Antony's military power to secure her position and expand Egypt's territory. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Each had something the other required. Their relationship was as much about statecraft as about romance. In 40 before the Common Era, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She named them Alexander Helios, sun, and Cleopatra Selene, moon. By this time, Antony had already left Alexandria, called back to Italy by political crises. His wife Fulvia and his brother had led a revolt against Octavian, attempting to seize control of Italy. The revolt failed, and Fulvia died shortly thereafter. To maintain the precarious alliance of the triumvirate, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavian. She was beautiful, intelligent, and virtuous, everything a Roman matron should be. The marriage was purely political, designed to bind Antony and Octavian together through family ties. For a few years, it seemed to work. Antony settled in Athens with Octavia and focused on his responsibilities in the east. But in 37 before the Common Era, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Syria. His planned invasion of Parthia required resources, and only Egypt could provide the enormous quantities of grain, ships, and gold that such a campaign demanded. Cleopatra agreed to fund the expedition, but in return, she negotiated the recovery of territories that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic Empire. Antony granted her control of Cyprus, portions of Phoenician cities including Jericho with its valuable balsam groves, and parts of Judea and Arabia. These were rich lands that dramatically increased Egypt's wealth and restored something of the empire's former territorial extent. For the first time in generations, the Ptolemaic kingdom expanded rather than contracted. Antony also formally recognized Cleopatra's twins as his children. This was significant because it gave them a claim to Roman as well as Egyptian heritage, positioning them as potential rulers of a unified empire that would combine Roman military power with Egyptian wealth and culture. The Parthian campaign of 36 before the Common Era, however, was a disaster. Antony led 50,000 Roman legionaries deep into Parthian territory, but his supply train was destroyed. His forces became overstretched, and the Parthians used their cavalry and archers to harass and ambush the Romans constantly. Antony was forced to retreat, losing thousands of men to Parthian arrows and the bitter cold of winter. It was one of the worst defeats suffered by Roman arms in this period. After this disaster, Antony returned to Alexandria rather than Athens, choosing Cleopatra over his Roman wife. He sent a message to Octavia, who was traveling to Athens with supplies and reinforcements for him, telling her to remain in Rome. It was a deliberate insult, a public rejection of his marriage to Octavian, his sister, in favor of his relationship with the Egyptian queen. For the next several years, Antony made Alexandria his base. He and Cleopatra had another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, in 36 before the Common Era. Antony's armies conducted campaigns in Armenia and along the eastern frontier, restoring Roman prestige after the Parthian defeat. But increasingly, Antony's life was centered on Egypt and Cleopatra rather than Rome and Roman tradition. In 34 before the Common Era, Antony staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a great ceremony in the city's gymnasium, with Cleopatra seated on a golden throne as the new Isis and Antony beside her, He formally granted vast territories to Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings, co-ruler with Cleopatra of Egypt and Cyprus. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and Parthia when it should be conquered. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus received Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. These donations were controversial on multiple levels. First, Antony was distributing Roman provinces and client kingdoms as if they were his personal property, disregarding the Senate's authority. Second, he was elevating Cleopatra's children, including Caesarion, Caesar's son, to positions of power, potentially threatening Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir. Third, the entire ceremony had an oriental, monarchical quality that offended Roman sensibilities. Octavian, sensing an opportunity to destroy his rival, began a propaganda campaign against Antony. He portrayed Antony as having abandoned Roman values, as being enslaved by an exotic foreign queen who used her sexual power to control him. He claimed that Antony planned to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, that he intended to make Cleopatra Empress of Rome. The Senate Candia, under pressure from Octavian, stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not on Antony himself, but on Cleopatra. This was a clever move by Octavian. By declaring war on Cleopatra rather than Antony, Octavian avoided the appearance of starting another civil war between Romans. He could claim to be defending Rome against a foreign threat. In reality, of course, it was a civil war. About 40% of the Senate, including both consuls, sided with Antony and left Rome to join him in Greece. Antony commanded roughly 200,000 soldiers and 500 warships. Octavian had comparable forces. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine who would rule the Mediterranean world. The battle that changed history in 31 before the Common Era. Both armies gathered in Greece. Antony established his base at Actium, a promontory on the western coast, where a narrow, straight lead from the Ionian Sea into the Ambracian Gulf. It was a strong defensive position, with the Gulf providing a sheltered harbor for his fleet. Octavian, with his brilliant naval commander Marcus Agrippa, moved to cut off Antony's supply lines. The War of Actium was as much about logistics and patience as about battle. Agrippa seized key coastal cities, cutting Antony's communications with Egypt. Antony's forces, encamped in the unhealthy marshlands around Actium, began to suffer from disease. Malaria swept through the camps. Morale plummeted. Desertions began, first by individuals, then by whole units. Antony faced a terrible choice. His position at Actium was becoming untenable, but he could not easily retreat by land without abandoning his fleet and much of his army. Some of his generals urged him to march inland, away from the coast, and fight a land battle where Roman discipline might prevail. But Cleopatra advised him to fight at sea, to break through Octavian's blockade and return to Egypt, where he could regroup and continue the war. Antony chose the naval option, influenced by Cleopatra's counsel. On the 2nd of September 31 before the Common Era, Antony led his fleet out through the strait at Actium to engage Octavian's forces. The battle was one of the largest naval engagements in ancient history, with hundreds of ships on each side. Antony's ships were large quinquiremes, heavy warships with bronze rams on their prows and towers filled with soldiers. They were powerful but slow, difficult to maneuver. Octavian's fleet consisted of smaller, more agile Liburnian galleys that could dart around the larger vessels, using speed and maneuverability rather than brute force. The battle began amid the two fleets maneuvered cautiously, neither willing to commit fully. Antony tried to draw Octavian's fleet into close combat, where the superior size of his ships would give him an advantage. Agrippa avoided direct engagement, keeping his ships at a distance, using fire arrows and projectiles. Then, in the afternoon, something happened that has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian warships, which had been positioned behind Antony's line, suddenly raised their purple sails and drove through a gap in the battle, heading for the open sea in Egypt. What happened next is even more controversial. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, broke off from the battle. He had transferred to a faster ship and followed her with about 40 of his vessels. He abandoned his fleet and his army, chasing after Cleopatra across the Mediterranean. Why did Antony do this? Ancient sources, particularly those writing after Octavian's victory, portrayed Antony as being so besotted with Cleopatra that he could not bear to let her leave without him, that he chose love over duty and honor. Plutarch wrote that Antony's soul dwelled in Cleopatra's body, that he was dragged along by her like a man who had lost his own will. But this interpretation may be too simplistic, influenced by propaganda intended to discredit Antony. Modern historians have proposed other explanations. Perhaps the breakout was planned from the start, a coordinated attempt to escape the blockade with as much of the fleet and treasury as possible. Perhaps Antony and Cleopatra knew the battle was already lost and decided to preserve their resources for future campaigns. Or perhaps the situation was more complex, the decision made in the chaos of battle. With imperfect information and terrible time pressure, we will never know for certain what passed through Antony's mind in that moment when he chose to follow Cleopatra rather than stay with his fleet. What we do know is that the Battle of Actium, such as it was, ended in complete victory for Octavian. Antony's remaining fleet, demoralized by the departure of their commander, surrendered. His land forces held out for 7 more days before they too surrendered. 200 ships were captured or destroyed. 5,000 soldiers died, but many more joined Octavian's forces. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria with a fraction of their fleet, carrying whatever treasure they had been able to load aboard their ships. They found themselves in a desperate situation. Their forces were scattered and defeated. Octavian controlled the Mediterranean. It was only a matter of time before he marched on Egypt itself. Cleopatra began making preparations for various possibilities. She had her fleet hauled over land from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, planning a possible escape to India or Arabia. She stockpiled poisons, testing them on prisoners to determine which would provide the quickest, least painful death. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, offering him wealth and her abdication in exchange for allowing her children to rule Egypt. Octavian refused all terms. He wanted Cleopatra and her wealth, and he wanted Egypt itself to become a Roman province, the richest addition to the empire. He sent polite but non-committal responses to Cleopatra's overtures while preparing his invasion. Antony and Cleopatra dissolved their society of inimitable livers and founded a new one, the Companions to the Death. The name was grimly appropriate. They held banquets and philosophical discussions, knowing that their time was running out, living with the certainty of approaching doom. In late July of 30 before the Common Era, Octavian's forces reached the outskirts of Alexandria. Antony led a sortie against Octavian's cavalry and achieved a small victory, driving them back. It was his last military success. The next day, when he ordered his fleet and cavalry to attack, they instead defected to Octavian. Antony, watching his forces join his enemy without a fight, was devastated. He returned to the palace in a rage, shouting that Cleopatra had betrayed him, that she had sold him to Octavian. Cleopatra, fearing Antony's fury, fled to the mausoleum she had constructed on the palace grounds, a 2-story structure designed to be her tomb. She barricaded herself inside with her 2 most faithful attendants, Eras and Charmian, and sent a message to Antony that she was dead. Whether Cleopatra actually intended to deceive Antony, or merely to protect herself from his anger, is unclear. What is certain is that Antony, receiving the message that Cleopatra was dead, decided that there was nothing left for him to live for. He called for his servant Eros, who had pledged to kill Antony if he ever commanded it. Antony asked Eros to fulfill his pledge. Eros drew his sword, but instead of striking Antony, he turned the blade on himself and fell dead at Antony's feet. Antony, moved by this final act of loyalty, took up his own sword and stabbed himself in the stomach. The wound was mortal, but death was not immediate. As Antony lay bleeding, another message arrived. Cleopatra was not dead. She was alive in her mausoleum. Antony begged to be taken to her. His servants carried him through the palace grounds to the mausoleum. Cleopatra would not open the doors, fearing that Octavian's soldiers might force their way in. Instead, she and her attendants lowered ropes from an upper window and hauled Antony up, bleeding and dying, into the mausoleum. Plutarch's description of this scene is heartbreaking. Cleopatra laid Antony on a couch, tore her clothes, beat her breast, smeared herself with his blood. Calling him her lord, her emperor, her husband, Antony told her not to grieve, that he had lived a good life and won glory. He asked her to trust Gaius Procalios, one of Octavian's officers, to treat her honorably. Then Mark Antony died in Cleopatra's arms on the 1st of August, 30, before the Common Era. The last days of the last Pharaoh Octavian now controlled Alexandria. Cleopatra remained barricaded in her mausoleum, surrounded by the treasure she had accumulated there: gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, ebony, ivory, enormous quantities of wealth. She sent messages to Octavian, attempting to negotiate. Octavian sent polite replies, and Procholaus, whom Antony had recommended she trusts, to speak with her. Procholaus tried to convince Cleopatra to surrender, to trust in Octavian's mercy. Cleopatra, speaking to him through the barred door of the mausoleum, made her terms clear. She would hand over the treasure if Octavian would allow her children to rule Egypt. While these negotiations proceeded, Octavian's soldiers secretly scaled the walls of the mausoleum and captured Cleopatra before she could harm herself. She was taken to the palace and placed under guard. Octavian visited her once, a brief, cold meeting. Cleopatra tried to use her legendary charm, but Octavian was not Caesar or Antony. He was calculating, disciplined, immune to the appeal that had worked on other Roman leaders. He wanted Egypt's wealth and Egypt's grain, and he needed Cleopatra alive to parade in his triumph in Rome. A Roman triumph was the highest honor that could be bestowed on a victorious general. It involved a procession through the streets of Rome, with the general riding in a golden chariot, preceded by wagons displaying captured treasure and followed by conquered enemies in chains. Octavian planned to celebrate his victory over Egypt with a triumph, and Cleopatra would be the centerpiece, the living symbol of Rome's conquest. Cleopatra understood what this meant. She would be dragged through Rome's streets, jeered at by crowds, humiliated before her enemies. Her sister Arsinoe had suffered this fate years before, paraded in Caesar's triumph after the Alexandrian War. Cleopatra was determined not to endure such degradation. The exact circumstances of Cleopatra's death have been debated for 2 millennia. The most famous version, the one that has captivated artists and writers, is that she died from the bite of an asp, an Egyptian cobra. According to this account, Cleopatra had an asp smuggled into her chambers, hidden in a basket of figs. She held the snake to her breast, and its venom killed her quickly and relatively painlessly. This story has powerful symbolic resonance. The asp was the symbol of Egyptian royalty, worn on the crowns of pharaohs. By dying from an asp bite, Cleopatra was asserting her identity as pharaoh even in death, choosing to die by the symbol of her power rather than submit to Roman captivity. The asp story appears in multiple ancient sources. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, about 100 years after Cleopatra's death, presented it as the most commonly accepted account. He wrote that when Octavian's guards broke into Cleopatra's chamber, they found her lying dead on a golden couch, wearing her royal robes and crown. There were small puncture wounds on her arm, suggesting a snake bite. Some of Octavian's soldiers claimed to have seen snake tracks in the sand outside her window. Octavian himself promoted the asp story. When he celebrated his triumph in Rome, having defeated Cleopatra and conquered Egypt, he had her image carried in the procession, with an asp clinging to her arm. This visual representation fixed the asp legend in Roman popular imagination. It transformed Cleopatra's death into a dramatic, exotic spectacle, reinforcing Roman stereotypes about the mysterious, dangerous East. But Plutarch, writing about a century after Cleopatra's death, presented this asp story, but also mentioned alternative accounts. Some sources, he wrote, claimed that Cleopatra kept poison in a hollow hairpin and pricked herself with it. Others suggested she drank poison. The Roman historian Crassus, though writing 2 centuries later, proposed that she might have used a poisoned ointment or a sharp implement to introduce poison into her bloodstream. These alternative theories merit serious consideration. Ancient sources tell us that Cleopatra had been studying poisons for months before her death. She reportedly tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, observing which provided quick, painless death and which caused prolonged suffering. Would such a methodical researcher really choose a snake bite with all its uncertainties? Modern historians and toxicologists have raised doubts about the asp theory. Egyptian cobras are large snakes, difficult to conceal in a basket of figs. Their bite is not always fatal, and when it is fatal, death is not quick or painless but involves hours of paralysis and suffocation. Would Cleopatra, who according to Plutarch tested poisons on prisoners to find the gentlest death, really choose such an unreliable method? The timeline also raises questions. According to ancient accounts, Cleopatra sent a message to Octavian requesting that she be buried with Antony. A guard carried this message to Octavian, who was staying in the palace. Alarmed, Octavian immediately sent soldiers to Cleopatra's chambers. They arrived to find her already dead. But how long would this sequence of events take? The guard would need a few minutes to reach Octavian, a few minutes for Octavian to order soldiers to Cleopatra's chambers, another few minutes for the soldiers to arrive, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes total. Yet cobra venom typically takes hours to kill, and death would be preceded by obvious symptoms like difficulty breathing, convulsions, and loss of consciousness. The timing doesn't align well with death by snakebite. Some scholars have suggested that Cleopatra used a mixture of poisons, hemlock, combined with opium, and perhaps aconite, also known as wolfsbane. This combination would cause death by respiratory paralysis, or the opium ensured that the victim would be unconscious and feel no pain. Such a poison would be certain, quick, and painless, exactly what Cleopatra would have wanted. Hemlock, the poison that killed Socrates, was well known in the ancient world. It causes progressive paralysis, starting with the extremities and moving toward the core of the body. The victim remains conscious as their body becomes unable to move, until finally the paralysis reaches the respiratory system and breathing stops. Adding opium to this mixture would render the victim unconscious, sparing them the horror of being aware while unable to move or breathe. Aconite, derived from the monkshood plant, was considered one of the most reliable poisons in the ancient world. It acts quickly, typically killing within an hour. Its effects include numbness, nausea, and eventually heart failure. Combined with hemlock and opium, it would ensure quick, certain death. Such a poison cocktail would fit everything we know about Cleopatra's final hours. It would act quickly enough to kill her before Octavian's soldiers arrived. It would be painless due to the opium. It would be certain, not dependent on whether a snake chose to inject venom, and it would be consistent with Cleopatra's careful study of poisons in the weeks before her death. Others have even proposed that Cleopatra did not commit suicide at all, that Octavian had her murdered but arranged for the death to look like suicide to avoid the political liability of executing a queen. This theory points to the fact that Cleopatra's 2 attendants died at the same time she did, which would be unlikely if she had used a snake bite, but makes sense if all 3 women were assassinated. Octavian had strong motives to want Cleopatra dead. She was a potential rallying point for Egyptian resistance. Her son Caesarion was a rival to Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir. Her death would allow Octavian to confiscate Egypt's enormous wealth without needing to negotiate or make concessions. But murdering a queen who had sued for peace would look barbaric and tyrannical. If Octavian ordered Cleopatra's murder but disguised it as suicide, he could claim she chose death over surrender, a noble end that absolved him of responsibility. The Asp story, with its dramatic, exotic qualities, was perfect propaganda. It cast Cleopatra as tragic and romantic while obscuring any suggestion that she might have been murdered. However, most modern historians believe Cleopatra did indeed commit suicide, though perhaps not by aspite. She had every reason to choose death. She had seen what happened to defeated queens paraded in Roman triumphs. Her sister Arsinoe had been subjected to this humiliation after the Alexandrian War. Cleopatra was determined not to suffer the same fate. Ancient sources record that when one of Octavian's men told her she would be sent to Rome in 3 days, Cleopatra understood that her time was running out. She requested permission to visit Antony's tomb one final time. Octavian, not seeing this as threatening, granted her request. She went to the tomb, made offerings, embraced Antony's sarcophagus, and spoke to him as though he could hear. Then she returned to her chambers, bathed, dressed in her finest royal robes, and arranged herself on her golden couch as though preparing for a formal audience. She put on her crown. She called her attendants Eras and Charmian, women who had served her for years, who were loyal unto death. Together, they took whatever poison Cleopatra had prepared, whether it was asp venom, a poison cocktail, or some other means. We will never know with certainty how Cleopatra died. What we do know is that on the 10th or 12th of August, 30 before the Common Era, Octavian's guards broke into Cleopatra's chambers and found her lying dead on a golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, wearing her crown. Eras lay dead at her feet. Charmian, barely alive, was adjusting Cleopatra's crown. When one of the guards asked if this was well done, Charmian replied, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended from so many royal kings." Then she, too, died. The loyalty of these 2 women speaks volumes about Cleopatra's character. They chose to die with their queen rather than live without her, or perhaps rather than face interrogation and torture by Octavian's forces. Their devotion suggests that Cleopatra inspired genuine loyalty, not merely the obedience that power compels. In her final moments, she was not alone but surrounded by those who had chosen to share her fate. Ancient sources describe how Octavian attempted to revive Cleopatra, calling for physicians, trying various remedies. This might have been genuine if he truly wanted her alive for his triumph, or it might have been theater, demonstrating for witnesses that he had not wanted her death. We could not know his true feelings, only his actions. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years, through war and intrigue, alliance and betrayal. She had borne children to two of the most powerful men in the world. She had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, administered one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, and she had chosen her death, maintaining control over her fate until the very end. Octavian permitted Cleopatra to be buried with Antony, as she had requested. The location of their tomb has never been found. Over the centuries, Alexandria suffered earthquakes, invasions, and the rise of the Mediterranean Sea. The palace complex where Cleopatra lived, the mausoleum where Antony died, the tomb where they were buried together, all lie beneath the waters of Alexandria's harbor or buried under the modern city. Cleopatra's children suffered various fates. Caesarion, Caesar's son, was found and executed by Octavian's soldiers as he tried to flee Egypt. Octavian could not allow a potential rival to live, especially one who could claim to be Caesar's legitimate heir. Cleopatra's other three children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. The story of Caesarion's death is particularly tragic. Cleopatra, anticipating defeat, had sent her 17-year-old son south toward Ethiopia, hoping he might escape to India or another distant land where Octavian's reach could not extend. Caesarion traveled with tutors and a considerable sum of money, enough to establish himself wherever he found refuge. But one of his tutors, a Greek named Rhoden, betrayed him. Whether motivated by Roman gold or fear of punishment if he did not cooperate, Rhoden sent word to Octavian of Caesarion's location and route. Octavian dispatched soldiers who captured the young man before he could escape Egypt. There was no trial, no public announcement. Caesarion simply disappeared from history, killed quietly to prevent any future challenges to Octavian's power. Octavian later justified this murder with a saying that became famous: "Too many Caesars is not good." He was Caesar's adopted son and heir. He could not permit Caesar's biological son to live, could not allow anyone to question his claim to Caesar's legacy. So, the boy who might have united Egypt and Rome, who might have inherited both his father's military genius and his mother's political acumen, died before he could reach adulthood, another victim of the power struggles that defined this era. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph, walking in golden chains through the streets of Rome, but they were spared execution. Raised instead by Octavian's sister, Octavian, ironically, the same woman whose marriage to Antony they had helped destroy. Of the twins, only Cleopatra Selene's subsequent fate is known. She was married to Juba II, king of Mauritania, a client kingdom in North Africa. She ruled alongside her husband, bringing with her scholars and artists from Alexandria, preserving something of Egyptian culture in her new kingdom. Her children carried Ptolemaic blood into the Roman world, where it mixed with the bloodlines of Roman nobility. The fate of Cleopatra Selene is worth examining in detail, for she represents the continuation of her mother's legacy in ways both sad and triumphant. The young girl who had been born in Alexandria to the most powerful couple in the Mediterranean world, who had been declared queen of vast territories and the donations of Alexandria, found herself a prisoner in Rome, paraded through the streets for the entertainment of Roman crowds. But Octavia, who took the three children into her household, was not cruel. She raised them alongside her own children and those of her brother Octavian, giving them a proper Roman education. Cleopatra Selene would have learned Latin and Greek, studied Roman history and literature, been trained in the skills expected of a Roman noblewoman. Yet she never forgot her Egyptian heritage, never abandoned her mother's memory. When she married Juba to around 25 before the Common Era, she was approximately 15 years old. Juba was the son of a Numidian king who had opposed Caesar and been defeated. Like Cleopatra Selene, Juba had been brought to Rome as a child after his father's defeat. He had been educated in Rome, had become a scholar renowned for his learning, had written books on history and geography. In many ways, He was an ideal match for her, someone who understood what it meant to be royalty, dispossessed, educated in Rome, but never fully Roman. Together, they ruled Mauritania, transforming their capital Caesarea, modern Churchill in Algeria, into a center of Hellenistic culture. Cleopatra Selene brought scholars, artists, and craftsmen from Alexandria. She had temples built in a style that blended Roman, Greek, and Egyptian elements. She minted coins showing her own image, reminiscent of her mother's coins, asserting her own authority as queen. She had children with Juba, including a son named Ptolemy, maintaining the family name that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Through her, Ptolemaic blood continued, and something of Egypt's Hellenistic culture survived the Roman conquest. When Cleopatra Selene died around 5 of the Common Eras, she was buried with honors befitting a queen. Her son Ptolemy inherited Mauritania, ruling until he was summoned to Rome by the Emperor Caligula and executed, perhaps because he displayed too much independence, or wore purple robes that were supposed to be reserved for emperors, or simply because Caligula was mad and paranoid. The fates of Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, Cleopatra's other children with Antony, are unknown. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph, then disappear from historical records. Some historians speculate they died young, perhaps of illness, perhaps of less natural causes. Others suggest they might have lived quiet lives, deliberately keeping themselves out of historical record to avoid attracting dangerous attention. We simply do not know. Their disappearance from history is itself a kind of tragedy. Children of legendary parents reduced to historical footnotes, their lives and deaths unrecorded. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Octavian took control personally, making Egypt his private property rather than a province administered by the Senate. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's wealth enriched Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, was ended. The long twilight of the Hellenistic Age, that period of Greek culture spreading across the Mediterranean and Near East, following Alexander the Great's conquests, finally closed. Rome was ascendant, and the world had changed forever. 3 years later, in 27 before the Common Era, the Roman Senate granted Octavian the title Augustus, the revered one. The Roman Republic, which had existed for nearly 500 years, formally became the Roman Empire, with Augustus as its first emperor. The civil wars that had torn Rome apart for decades were over. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, settled over the Mediterranean world. It would last for 200 years. Legacy, the woman who defied empire. For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has fascinated and frustrated historians, inspired artists and writers, been both celebrated and condemned. Her story has been told and retold in countless versions, each generation reimagining her according to its own preoccupations and values. The ancient sources that documented her life were almost all written by her enemies or their descendants. Roman historians portrayed Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who corrupted virtuous Roman men, who used her sexual power to manipulate Caesar and Antony, leading both to their doom. She was described as decadent, scheming, un-Roman in every way. Augustus himself promoted this narrative. His propaganda machine worked tirelessly to paint Cleopatra as a foreign threat to Rome, an oriental queen who had bewitched noble Romans. By emphasizing Cleopatra's role, Augustus could claim that his war had been against a foreign enemy rather than against fellow Romans. He could present himself as Rome's savior rather than the victor in a civil war. But even in these hostile accounts, traces of the real Cleopatra emerge. Plutarch, despite relying on sources favorable to Augustus, could not help but convey something of Cleopatra's intelligence and charm. He wrote that she spoke numerous languages fluently, that she could engage in philosophical discourse, that her personality was irresistible to those who met her. The historian Dio Cassius, writing 2 centuries after Cleopatra's death, described her as remarkably intelligent and astute. He noted that she administered Egypt competently, maintaining its prosperity even through difficult times. Other ancient sources confirm that Cleopatra was well trained in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. Archaeological evidence has added to our understanding. Inscriptions from Egypt show Cleopatra participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, dedicating temples, presenting herself in the traditional role of pharaoh. Coins, minted during her reign, show her profile, practical, rather than idealized, suggesting that she emphasized her role as ruler rather than trading on mere beauty. Modern scholars have worked to separate the historical Cleopatra from the legend. They emphasize her political acumen, her ability to maintain Egypt's independence in the face of Roman expansion for over 2 decades. At a time when Rome was absorbing kingdom after kingdom, Cleopatra not only kept Egypt independent, but actually expanded its territory. Her linguistic abilities were extraordinary. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 300 years to learn the Egyptian language, which allowed her to communicate directly with her Egyptian subjects, rather than requiring interpreters. This was not merely a personal accomplishment, but a deliberate political strategy, positioning herself as a true pharaoh, rather than a foreign Greek overlord. Cleopatra's relationships with Caesar and Antony were strategic as much as romantic. She needed Roman military support to maintain her position and expand Egyptian power. Caesar and Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund their political and military campaigns. These were alliances between equals, or near equals, with both sides negotiating from positions of strength. The children she bore, Caesar and Antony, were not merely the products of love affairs, but deliberate attempts to create dynastic links between Egypt and Rome. If Caesarion had survived and been accepted as Caesar's heir, he might have united the 2 greatest powers in the Mediterranean. If Antony and Cleopatra had won at Actium, their children might have ruled a vast empire stretching from Spain to Parthia. In the centuries after her death, Cleopatra's story was shaped by changing cultural attitudes. Medieval writers, influenced by Christianity's teachings about the dangers of female sexuality, portrayed her as a dangerous temptress. Renaissance artists painted her as an idealized beauty, focusing on scenes of her death, which provided an excuse to depict the female form while maintaining moral respectability. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1607, created a version of Cleopatra that has influenced all subsequent depictions. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is passionate, mercurial, theatrical, by turns generous and petty, loving and suspicious. She is neither purely villain nor purely heroine, but a complex, contradictory character, one of Shakespeare's greatest female roles. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Western powers colonized North Africa and the Middle East, Cleopatra was often portrayed as an exotic Oriental queen, her ethnicity deliberately ambiguous, her sexuality emphasized over her political abilities. This Orientalist vision of Cleopatra reflected European fantasies about the East rather than historical reality. Films about Cleopatra have been made since the early days of cinema. The 1917 version starred Theda Bara, presenting Cleopatra as a vampire-like seductress. The 1934 version with Claudette Colbert emphasized spectacle and romance. But the most famous film version is the 1963 epic, starring Elizabeth Taylor, directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. This film, one of the most expensive ever made at the time, nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. Taylor's Cleopatra is beautiful, intelligent, and commanding, a woman who understands power and uses every tool at her disposal to maintain it. The film emphasizes her relationships with Caesar and Antony, the political dimension of these relationships as much as the romantic. Despite its historical liberties, the film captures something essential about Cleopatra: her refusal to submit, her determination to control her own destiny. More recently, there has been increased attention to the question of Cleopatra's ethnicity. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals, but the identity of Cleopatra's mother is uncertain, and it is possible that Cleopatra had Egyptian ancestry, perhaps from a concubine in her father's court. Some scholars and artists have portrayed Cleopatra as African, emphasizing Egypt's location in Africa and the possibility of indigenous Egyptian or other African heritage. This has sparked controversy, with some Egyptians insisting that Cleopatra was Greek and therefore light-skinned, while others argue for a more nuanced understanding of ethnicity and race in the ancient Mediterranean. What seems clear is that Cleopatra herself emphasized her role as Egyptian pharaoh rather than Greek queen. She learned the Egyptian language, participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and had herself depicted in Egyptian artistic style. She understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she needed to connect with Egyptian tradition and culture, not just the Greek elite of Alexandria. Cleopatra's intelligence has been emphasized by scholars seeking to rescue her reputation from centuries of focus on her supposed beauty and sexuality. Ancient sources agree that she was brilliant, well-educated, cultured, capable of engaging with the leading intellectuals of her time. Her library in Alexandria continued to be supported during her reign. She attracted scholars and philosophers to her court. Her political skills were formidable. She maintained Egypt's independence for more than 2 decades against the most powerful empire the world had yet seen. She negotiated alliances, formed strategic relationships, expanded her territory, and nearly succeeded in creating a dynasty that would have united East and West. Her ultimate defeat was not a failure of intelligence or ability, but a consequence of forces too large for any single person to control. Rome's power was overwhelming. The civil wars that convulsed the Roman world would have consumed Egypt eventually, regardless of who sat on its throne. Cleopatra fought against historical currents that could not be reversed, but she fought with remarkable skill and determination, and in the end, she controlled one thing that Octavian could not take from her: her death. By choosing suicide over surrender, Cleopatra denied Octavian the triumph of parading her through Rome's streets. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, a queen until the end. Conclusion: the Queen of Memory. In the depths of night, when we look back across the centuries to ancient Alexandria, what do we see? We see a woman who spoke 9 languages, who commanded fleets and armies, who bore the children of Rome's greatest generals. We see a queen who expanded her kingdom's borders when other Hellenistic states were shrinking into nothing. We see a scholar who supported the Library of Alexandria, preserving and promoting knowledge even as her world crumbled around her. But we also see the gaps in our knowledge, the uncertainties that'll never be resolved. We don't know for certain how she died, only that she chose death over captivity. We don't know where she is buried, only that she lies somewhere beneath Alexandria, perhaps with Antony beside her. We don't know her mother's identity, which means we don't fully understand her ancestry. These gaps in the historical record have allowed each age to remake Cleopatra according to its own image. Medieval Christians saw a dangerous seductress. Renaissance artists saw classical beauty. Victorian imperialists saw exotic oriental mystery. Modern feminists see a powerful woman navigating a world dominated by men. Perhaps Cleopatra's greatest legacy is not what she accomplished in her lifetime, remarkable though those accomplishments were, but her transformation into a symbol that transcends history. She represents female power in a male-dominated world, intelligence matched with beauty, ambition tempered with pragmatism, the East confronting the West, the individual standing against empire. Her story reminds us that power is always precarious, that even the wealthiest kingdoms and strongest rulers are vulnerable to the tides of history. Egypt, which had survived for 3,000 years, fell in Cleopatra's lifetime. The Hellenistic age, which had flourished for 3 centuries, ended with her death. Rome itself, triumphant in her time, would eventually fall to new powers. Nothing is permanent. All empires fade, all reigns end, but some stories, some names, some legends survive. 20 centuries after Cleopatra's death, we still speak her name. We still tell her story. We still wonder about the woman behind the legend, the queen behind the myth. In the hieroglyphs carved on temple walls at Dendora, Cleopatra stands eternal, crowned as pharaoh, making offerings to the gods. In the pages of Plutarch and Shakespeare, she speaks with eloquence and passion. In films and paintings and operas, she dazzles and seduces. In historical scholarship, she emerges slowly from the propaganda that obscured her, revealed as clever and capable, a ruler who almost changed the course of history. This is Cleopatra's legacy, not just what she did in life, but how she has lived on in memory and imagination. The last pharaoh of Egypt became the first immortal of the post-ancient world. Her story retold endlessly, her image recreated in every medium, her name synonymous with beauty, power, ambition, and tragic grandeur. When Octavian conquered Egypt, he thought he was writing the ending to Cleopatra's story. He believed that by making Egypt a Roman province, by erasing the Ptolemaic dynasty, by denying Cleopatra her triumph, he had defeated her utterly. But in the long view of history, Octavian's victory was temporary, while Cleopatra's legend proved eternal. Augustus died in 14 of the Common Eras, 44 years after Cleopatra. His empire lasted, in the West, until the 5th century, in the East, until the 15th century. Then it too passed into history. But Cleopatra remains, not as she was. Perhaps we can never fully know that woman. But as she has become in our collective imagination, the Queen of the Nile, the last pharaoh, the woman who defied Rome. As we close this journey through her life and legacy, as we return from ancient Alexandria to our own time, consider what Cleopatra's story teaches us about power and its limits, about intelligence and determination, about choosing one's own path even when all paths lead to darkness, about refusing to submit even in the face of overwhelming force, about dying with dignity when all else is lost. These are the lessons that have made Cleopatra immortal, that have kept her story alive for 2,000 years. These are the reasons we still whisper her name in the night, still tell her tale, still wonder what truly happened in that final moment when she chose death over captivity, when Egypt's last queen closed her eyes and passed into legend. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient history and tragic power, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what aspect of Cleopatra's story fascinated you most. Were you drawn to her relationship with Caesar, her partnership with Antony, the mystery of her death, or perhaps something else entirely? Remember that history is not just facts and dates, but stories about human beings who lived and loved, struggled and suffered, achieved and failed, just as we do. Their world was different from ours, but their hopes and fears, their ambitions and dreams, these resonate across the centuries. Cleopatra lived more than 2,000 years ago, but her story still speaks to us. Perhaps that is the ultimate measure of a historical figure, not how they were remembered by the generation that immediately followed them, but whether their story continues to matter to people living in completely different times and circumstances. By that measure, Cleopatra's legacy is secure. She has outlasted empires. She has survived the rise and fall of civilizations. She has been reborn in every new medium that human creativity has invented, from papyrus scrolls to printed books, from stage plays to opera, from silent films to streaming television. Cleopatra's story has been told and retold, adapted and reimagined, but never forgotten. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you will dream of marble palaces beside the Mediterranean, of golden barges sailing down the Nile, of a queen dressed as a goddess, of a woman who spoke 9 languages and commanded 2 continents, of the last pharaoh of Egypt, standing crowned and defiant as her world collapsed around her. Sleep well, and remember Cleopatra, the queen who refused to be forgotten. Until next time, this is Boring History, Stories for Sleep, reminding you that the past is never truly past, that history lives on in the stories we tell, and that sometimes the most powerful way to understand our present is to journey back into the long night of history, to walk for a while with those who came before us, to see through their eyes and feel with their hearts. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder and tragedy of ages past.